I had noticed her stepping away almost instinctively, a shadow moving along the edge of the room where laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Megan, she wasn't the type to demand attention, but somehow, even in a crowd, there was a quiet urgency about her movements, as if the rest of the world could wait. I followed, not because I needed to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. The balcony door creaked softly behind me, and the night air hit us with a cool breath that contrasted the warmth of the room. She leaned against the railing, shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the faint glimmer of the city lights below. "Do you ever feel like—" Her voice faltered, almost lost to the wind. She exhaled sharply. Then, as if plucking courage from somewhere she didn't know she had, she whispered, "I'm ashamed to admit I need someone." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to be. They just were. And in that moment I realized that she had carried them silently, letting them hover between us, fragile as glass. I didn't step closer or try to fix her with a gesture or a word of comfort she didn't ask for. I just said softly, "Then you need me." She turned, surprise flickering across her face like a candle struggling against the wind. I didn't elaborate, didn't smile or lean in. I just let it hang there. Presence, I had learned long ago, mattered more than anything you could force with speech. It wasn't about romance or desire. It was about being there, in a way that wasn't demanding, in a way that offered quiet certainty. She glanced at me for a long moment, then looked back toward the city, as if testing the solidity of her own confession. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was precise. It allowed space for honesty to settle, like dust on an untouched shelf. I could feel her hesitation, the way she measured the possibility of trust against the fear of disappointment. I don't usually say things like that," she murmured finally, almost to herself. The vulnerability in her voice was raw, a threadbare acknowledgement of solitude. I nodded, not to instruct or reassure, but simply to witness. "I know," I said, "and you don't have to explain it. I'm here." Something in her posture shifted minutely, a relaxation I didn't push, a letting go of a fragment of armor she didn't even know she'd been carrying. There was a rhythm to her breathing that matched the cadence of the night, steady, careful, and tentative. I stayed beside her, leaning slightly on the railing but keeping the distance that let her remain sovereign. The city below hummed with its own stories, distant and indifferent, and yet it felt like the two of us existed in a separate space, carved out of the same quiet urgency. I didn't know if this moment would become something more, or if it would dissolve like the mist over the streets. What mattered was that it existed, that she had said it, that I had answered. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time was slippery in the quiet. Eventually, she let out a small, almost inaudible laugh, startling in its delicacy. "You make it sound easier than it is," she admitted, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I only shook my head. "It isn't about easy," I said. "It's about being here, choosing to be here." And in that choice, unspoken yet palpable, something started. Something neither of us could define in words yet, but it was enough. The next morning, the memory of her words clung to me, not in an intrusive way, but with the weight of something unfinished, something quietly insistent. I didn't plan to see her again so soon, yet fate, or circumstance, seemed to conspire. A coffee shop down the street became our accidental meeting point, where the smell of fresh pastries and the hum of low conversations made the world feel slightly more bearable. She was sitting at a corner table, a book open but clearly unread, her hand resting against her temple as though holding herself together. I hesitated only a fraction of a second before stepping inside. She noticed me instantly, and for a moment, the corners of her lips hinted at a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I pulled out the chair across from her without asking, the gesture casual but deliberate. She didn't protest. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was cautious, like two people testing the temperature of water before fully immersing themselves. "I didn't expect to see you here," she finally said, her voice softer than it had been the night before, tempered with something unspoken, relief, maybe, or curiosity. "Neither did I replied, leaning back slightly, my hands folded over the table. "But I'm glad I did." She looked down at her, swirling the liquid inside as though the motion could steady her thoughts. "You make it sound simple," she said, almost laughing under her breath. "Like you just choose to be there and it fixes everything." I shook my head gently. "It's not simple. It's just, choosing doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to solve everything immediately. It just matters that you make it." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. There was a flicker of something fragile in them, an acknowledgement that she had been holding herself too tightly. And though she didn't reach for my hand, or lean in, or make any overt move toward me, I could feel the shift. She was no longer solely defending herself. She was beginning to consider the possibility that being seen didn't have to be threatening. We spoke then, cautiously, in small increments, about books we'd read and disliked, about the strange rhythm of the city in the early morning, about friends who seemed to float in and out of life without leaving traces. Each sentence was an anchor, tethering us to a mutual understanding that was forming quietly, steadily. Megan's laughter began to emerge in small bursts, shy at first, but gradually gaining warmth, and I listened, more than I spoke, aware that my presence was a reassurance in itself. Time slipped by unnoticed. The barista's voice, calling out names and orders, punctuated our conversation, but it didn't intrude. At one point, Megan caught me watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You don't have to look at me," she said, her voice betraying amusement but also vulnerability. "I'm not looking at," I said. "I'm noticing you." The difference hung in the air between us. She frowned lightly, then tilted her head, as if considering the weight of what I had just said. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It wasn't a promise, not yet. But it was an acknowledgement of her presence, of her value, and perhaps of the quiet fact that she had already begun to let someone in, even in the smallest measure. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the doorway. I didn't move to stop her. I didn't reach out. She turned back once, eyes lingering on mine for just a beat longer than necessary. That moment, brief, almost imperceptible, felt like a threshold, the subtle beginning of something that could grow if tended with care. The days after our coffee encounter carried a subtle tension, like a thread stretched just enough to feel, but not enough to break. I noticed her in small, quiet ways, how her gaze lingered on the horizon while she waited for the bus, how her fingers toyed with the edges of a notebook, how she laughed softly at things only half amusing. It was in these fragments of attention that I began to understand her rhythm, the cadence of a woman who measured life carefully before offering any part of herself. We began to meet in passing, initially by accident. A park bench in the late afternoon, the corner of a bookstore, a fleeting nod at a cafe. Each encounter was brief but charged, a careful choreography neither of us explicitly acknowledged. One afternoon, I found myself sitting beside her on a weathered bench near the pond, our conversation falling into long, comfortable silences. I didn't speak for a while, letting the air carry the sound of ducks moving through water, the rustling of leaves over. Megan seemed aware that I was there, and yet she didn't feel compelled to fill the emptiness with words. She just let herself be, and that in itself was a revelation. "You're always so calm," she said after several minutes, her voice low, as if testing the silence. "I notice things," I replied, "and I don't always need to comment on them." She tilted her head, a thoughtful frown forming between her brows. "It's unusual," she murmured. Most people insist on making you react, on filling the spaces with noise. I prefer to observe," I said simply. "Sometimes, what's left unsaid is as important as what is spoken." There was a pause, a moment of understanding stretching between us. I could sense her letting down a layer of restraint, a careful monitoring of her own emotion. She wasn't used to being unguarded in the presence of someone who didn't demand reciprocation. Yet with me, there was no pressure, no expectation, only the steady knowledge that I was present, and that presence alone could. We spent that afternoon on the bench, side by side, saying nothing, letting the gentle warmth of the sun filter through the branches above. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a language neither of us had formally learned but instinctively recognized. I could feel the subtle shifts in her posture, the gradual uncurling of shoulders that had been tense from habit, the lightening of her gaze that had often seemed weighted with caution. Eventually, she laughed softly, almost involuntarily, at a line from a book she had opened but not read aloud. "I guess even silences can become comfortable," she said, the words tasting like admission. I nodded, feeling the truth of it in a quiet, deliberate way. "Yes," I said. "Comfort doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it comes slowly, with patience, with attention paid without demand." The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening across the ground. As we rose from the bench to leave, Megan glanced at me, a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. No words were needed to confirm it. The silence had done its work, and for the first time, I realized that connection, real, unforced connection, didn't require declarations or dramatic moments. It could exist in the spaces between words, in the quiet observation of another human being learning, slowly, to trust. Sunday arrived with its usual quiet insistence, a day both empty and overwhelming in its stillness. Megan had called that morning, a simple, hesitant request that carried the subtle weight of unspoken expectation. She needed help assembling a bookcase in her apartment. Most people would have shrugged at the triviality of it, but I sensed the deeper significance, an invitation, a fragile offering of trust. I agreed without hesitation. Her apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a comfortable clutter that spoke of a life lived carefully, with attention to small detail. She met me at the door, a smile barely forming, hesitant, and perhaps even embarrassed at the need to rely on someone else. I didn't comment. I simply stepped in, carrying the box of screws and wooden panels like it was nothing extraordinary, because it wasn't. Ordinary moments often held the most profound significance. We spread the pieces on the living room floor, an array of flat wood and metal supports. Instruction manual open and unconsulted at our feet. Megan glanced at me, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I usually do this alone, she said, almost apologetically, as though admitting weakness required confession. You don't have to do everything alone, I said quietly. Not if you don't want to. Her hands hovered over a panel, unsure where to begin. I offered mine in a casual, unassuming way, not to take control, but to demonstrate collaboration. We can start here, I suggested, guiding her without commanding, allowing her to choose whether to follow or not. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried enormous weight. As we worked, the conversation drifted naturally from trivial observations, the way sunlight hit the walls, the stubbornness of screws that refused to stay in place, to deeper subjects, childhood routines, family pressures, the quiet anxieties that clung to our days like invisible threads. Megan spoke with a vulnerability that had been absent in our previous encounters, yet it was tempered by caution. She tested me with her words, not seeking answers, but gauging whether I could be present without judgment. The bookcase began to take shape, each shelf a testament to patience and quiet persistence. There were moments of laughter when pieces didn't align or a screw slipped, and moments of silence when concentration overtook conversation. Through it all, I noticed subtle shifts in her demeanor, the easing of a shoulder, a softer glance, the relaxation of a jaw that had held tension like armor. At one point, she paused, tools in hand, and looked at me with an expression that seemed to ask something unspoken. I didn't rush to answer. I simply nodded, letting the presence of my being convey what words could not, that I was there, steady, patient, and willing to shoulder the small and the significant alike. By the time the bookcase stood assembled, solid and upright against the wall, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled between us. It was not just a piece of furniture. It was a shared effort, a moment where trust and choice intertwined seamlessly. Megan leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. And I knew, as I left her apartment that evening, that something had begun to shift. A slow, deliberate recognition that being chosen, being relied upon, could be a quiet form of intimacy, built not on words or gestures, but on presence. It started with a distant rumble, barely audible at first, the kind of sound that slips beneath the consciousness until it becomes impossible to ignore. Megan called me that evening, her voice taut with unease. The power had gone out, and the wind rattled the windows in a way that made the apartment feel simultaneously small and exposed. She didn't ask for much, just someone to come. I didn't hesitate. By the time I arrived, carrying a lantern and 2 steaming mugs of tea, I understood that it wasn't just the storm outside that unsettled her. It was the storm she carried within. I set the lantern on the floor and offered her a cup. It's not much, I said, but it'll keep us warm. She accepted it without a word, her hands wrapping around the mug as though holding onto something tangible could ground her. The room was dim, shadows dancing along the walls as the lantern swayed gently with each gust of wind. I didn't try to fill the silence. Instead, I let it stretch, letting her feel that she wasn't alone. We settled on the floor, backs against the couch, legs stretched out awkwardly in the confined space. She opened a book, though I knew she wouldn't read much. The words were there to anchor her, a shared ritual rather than solitary escape. I read alongside her, my voice low, calm, steady. Occasionally, I glanced at her, noting how the flicker of lantern light softened the lines of her face, how her eyes, though alert, began to carry a trace of relaxation. At one point, she closed the book and sighed, leaning her head slightly toward me. I don't usually let someone just be, she admitted, almost whispering, as if the darkness itself might overhear her vulnerability. You don't have to, I said, careful not to impose. You just can. That's enough. She hesitated, then nodded, a tiny motion that carried far more meaning than words ever could. The storm outside seemed louder now, but inside, a different kind of quiet had taken root. It wasn't dramatic, and there was no sudden revelation. It was something slower, more deliberate, the kind of trust that grows in small increments, like water seeping through stone. The hours passed unnoticed. Occasionally, we would comment on the rain streaking the window, or the low hum of the city beneath the thunder, but most of the time, we simply existed in the same space. No need for conversation, no need for gestures, just presence, just acceptance. When the storm began to fade, and the first faint glow of streetlights touched the room, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not the full grin of comfort, but a beginning. I didn't respond with words. I simply nodded, acknowledging that this night, this quiet storm shared, had shifted something essential between us. By the time I left, the lantern was extinguished, but the wind had calmed. But inside Megan's apartment, and perhaps inside her, a subtle, unspoken change had settled, like the soft echo of rain against the wind, a promise that presence, once offered, could remain even after the storm passed. Megan invited me to dinner at her sister's apartment. I understood the nuance immediately. It wasn't casual. It was a small test of sorts, a careful step into territory she rarely shared. I didn't hesitate. I accepted the invitation without question, knowing that presence sometimes meant more than words, that trust often required simple actions rather than promises. Her sister's apartment was bright and warm, filled with the kind of easy chaos that comes with family. Plates clattered, voices overlapped, and yet Megan moved through it with a practiced ease, the kind that hides anxiety beneath a composed exterior. I walked beside her, quiet, observing, absorbing the rhythms of her world without interfering. She seemed tense, like she was measuring every gesture, every word. "Relax," I said softly as we entered the kitchen. "Just be yourself. I'm here." She glanced at me, a brief flicker of gratitude passing through her eyes, and nodded. The dinner began with small talk, and I engaged lightly, offering attentive listening rather than dominating conversation. I noticed the way she exhaled slightly when I answered questions for her with gentle confidence, without overstepping, as though my presence alone could serve as a quiet reassurance. Later, when dessert arrived, Megan pulled me aside. I'm afraid of people knowing me sometimes," she admitted, voice low, almost vulnerable. "I've believed before, with others, that opening up means disappointment follows. I don't want that again." I looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to stay if you want me to. That's all." Her eyes searched mine for a long moment, tracing the line of calm certainty I didn't try to justify, and slowly, her shoulders relaxed, a subtle surrender of a defense she hadn't let down in years. The conversation was brief, but it carried weight, the kind that lingers after the words have fallen silent. We returned to her apartment, quiet now, carrying with us the residue of shared space and understanding. She didn't touch my hand or lean in, and I didn't ask her to. The intimacy was there in the simple acts. The way we walked side by side, the ease of my presence without intrusion, the mutual respect for space and choice. As I left, Megan paused at the door, hesitation in her posture. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the dinner, not for conversation, but for being steady, for being a presence that didn't demand." I nodded. "You don't have to thank me. I'll be here." The night felt quieter than the evening before. I walked home with the sense that small, deliberate choices, like showing up, staying calm, remaining present, could carry the same weight as declarations of affection. And in that quiet, Megan had begun to understand that being chosen didn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes, it was simply knowing that someone would stay. It was one of those evenings when the city seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Megan and I were caught in a traffic jam, the kind where time slows and every honk, every shifting brake light becomes amplified. She sat beside me, gripping her bag tightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the red glow ahead. I could feel the tension radiating, the kind born from too many years of self-reliance and cautious observation. "You ever feel like no matter what you do, it just isn't enough?" she asked suddenly, voice low, almost lost amid the idling engines and distant sirens. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let her words hang in the air, acknowledging them without judgment. "I think everyone feels that sometimes," I said finally, turning slightly so my shoulder brushed hers in the small space. "But feeling it doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." She glanced at me briefly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "I'm scared," she admitted, almost whispering. "Scared that if I let someone in, they'll leave, that it will all end like it has before." I remained quiet for a moment, watching her hands, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes darted back to the traffic as though seeking distraction. "I don't know how to promise it won't end," I said honestly. "I can't predict the future, but I am here now. That's real, and I'm not going anywhere tonight." The words seemed to settle around her, like dust finally finding the corners of a room. She exhaled slowly, shoulders loosening fractionally, and I realized that trust was not a single declaration. It was built in moments like this, in the acknowledgement of fear without trying to erase it. We spoke then, in bursts, fragments of confession interspersed with laughter at absurd billboards and comments on the slow crawl of the traffic. Her voice grew steadier, her tone lighter, as if admitting vulnerability aloud could strip it of its weight. And I listened, not offering solutions or judgments, only the quiet constancy of presence. At one point, she reached over instinctively, resting a hand briefly on mine. Neither of us reacted, simply letting it remain, a fleeting connection that said more than words could. It wasn't romantic, not in the dramatic sense, It was foundational, a proof that she could allow someone close without immediate consequence. By the time the cars began to move, the city lights shimmering on wet asphalt, Megan's posture had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. The tense lines of apprehension softened, and her gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, carrying the unspoken acknowledgement of shared understanding. I didn't comment on it. I didn't need to. Some confessions are quieter than spoken words, and sometimes the best response is simply being there, steady, patient, unwavering. In that slow crawl through city traffic, I realized that the bond between us was forming not with grand gestures or declarations, but in the unassuming act of remaining, present, attentive, and chosen. The morning was quiet, the city still shaking off the remnants of the night. Megan called me unexpectedly, her voice careful, measured. "I have to tell you something," she said, almost reluctantly. I listened, letting the pause stretch long enough for her to decide how much she would reveal. She spoke then, about an opportunity, an offer for a project in another city, one that excited her and scared her in equal measure. Her words carried the weight of hesitation, the kind that comes when someone has been conditioned to doubt the permanence of support. I didn't flinch, didn't question, or probe. I had learned by now that the safest way to remain steady was to simply acknowledge what was being offered, what was being asked. "Then go," I said quietly, the statement simple but deliberate. "If it's what you want, I'll stay." The pause on the other end was almost tangible, her uncertainty filling the silence between us. You'll stay?" she asked, disbelief mingling with relief. "Yes," I said, "I'll stay, and I'll be here when you return. I'm not moving, Megan, not from this." She laughed softly, incredulous, and for a moment I heard the faint tremor of emotion words alone. Most people, trailing off as though trying to articulate a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to name before. "I'm not most people," I said, letting the truth of it hang between us. "And I'm not asking for anything. I'm here because I choose to be. Because being here matters more than explanations or assurances." The conversation shifted then, to the practicalities of her leave, the small details that mattered in the day-to-day, and yet in each exchange, I could sense the bond between us strengthening, subtle and undeniable. She was learning, slowly, that my presence was not conditional, that it wasn't tied to her performance or her decisions, but existed as a quiet, unshakable certainty. When she hung up, I sat back in my chair, thinking of the ordinary weight of a phone call transformed into something far more significant. The simple act of staying, of choosing to remain steady, had a gravity all its own. Megan had made a decision, and in that moment, I had made mine as well. Not to control or to persuade, but simply to offer the constancy that had begun to anchor us both. Even the ordinary morning seemed brighter. The light falling through the window carried a warmth I hadn't noticed before, as though acknowledging the quiet triumph of choice over uncertainty. Small choices, I realized, were often the ones that mattered most, shaping paths far more than declarations or promises. And for Megan, perhaps for the first time, someone had chosen to remain. The afternoon stretched lazily, the kind of quiet that invites reflection more than conversation. Megan had suggested meeting at her apartment, but without a plan, without urgency. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a blanket draped over her knees. Sunlight spilled through the windows, painting the room in soft golds and muted shadows. No words were needed at first. We moved around each other in a comfortable rhythm, each gesture deliberate yet effortless. We started with small things, unpacking a few groceries, arranging cups on the counter, sharing slices of bread and cheese. I noticed the subtle way she shifted the light to avoid glare on her eyes. The careful placement of her belongings in spaces she deemed safe was mundane, yet in the quiet, I could sense the significance. Trust was present here, woven into ordinary action. "I like these moments," she said suddenly, her voice tentative but clear, as if testing the air to see if it would hold her words. "No expectation, no performance, just us." I smiled softly, taking my time to pour her another cup of tea. "Yes," I said, "sometimes the most important connections happen without ceremony. They happen in quiet acknowledgement, in patience, in showing up." We settled on the floor, backs against the couch, the blanket now sharing space between us. For a long while, silence dominated, yet it was a silence that spoke. It carried everything we had yet to articulate: trust, curiosity, subtle reliance. I could feel her leaning in ever so slightly, a fraction closer than before, and I didn't move. I let the space exist as she wanted it, an unspoken permission for closeness without demands. She opened a book but didn't read aloud. Instead, she allowed the words to exist in the same room as us, background to our presence, a quiet punctuation to the comfort forming between us. Occasionally, she glanced at me, eyes softening in ways that suggested acknowledgement, of me, of herself, of the fact that she was letting someone share her space without fear. Time passed. measured not by clocks, but by the slow movement of light across the floor. At one point, she reached out, placing her hand near mine, not touching, only close enough to bridge the space. I didn't react, didn't withdraw. I simply allowed it. The subtle gravity of a gesture carrying more intimacy than words could ever achieve. As the sun dipped lower, painting the room in amber, she let out a soft sigh, a release of tension she hadn't noticed she was holding. The quiet was no longer empty. It was full of choice, of trust, of beginnings. And in that simple afternoon, shared in silence and ordinary acts, I sensed the unspoken foundation of something that could endure, built from presence, patience, and the gentle affirmation that she was not alone. The morning was quiet, but there was a tension beneath the stillness, subtle, yet persistent. Megan had called earlier, her voice carefully measured, the kind of tone that signals both excitement and hesitation. She told me about an opportunity, several months in another city, a project she had wanted for a long time. Her words were careful, weighed against the fear of what leaving might mean, of who or what she might leave behind. I listened without interruption, letting the spaces between her sentences stretch long enough for her to find her own rhythm. Then go, I said finally, my voice steady, deliberate. If that's what you want, I'll stay. The pause on the other end was almost tangible. You'll stay? She asked, disbelief mixed with cautious hope. Yes, I said, I'll stay. I'll be here. That's all I can promise, and all I choose to promise. Nothing more, nothing less. She exhaled slowly, a sound that carried both relief and lingering fear. Most people, she murmured, almost as if testing the air for a safe place to speak, most people would react differently. I'm not most people, I said. I'm here because I choose to be, not because I have to be, not because I'm waiting for something to happen, just because I am. The conversation shifted then. Practicalities and plans, the mundane logistics that should have felt trivial but instead carried weight. In each word, each decision, I sensed her slowly realizing the depth of choice in presence, how staying, quietly, without demand or expectation, could mean more than assurances or promises. When she hung up, I sat for a long moment, absorbing the ordinary day transformed into something profound. The city outside moved on, unaware of the subtle seismic shift in a small apartment somewhere above its street. Megan had chosen to pursue her path, and I had chosen to remain, not as a restraint, not as a plea, but as a quiet, deliberate constancy. Later, when I arrived at her apartment to see her before she left, she opened the door, hesitation in her posture. I didn't ask questions, I didn't speak, I simply nodded, a gesture carrying all the meaning she didn't need me to put into it. She lingered for a moment, the weight of choice, trust, and vulnerability balanced on that silent threshold. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, a small acknowledgement of the unspoken understanding between us. Then, slowly, she stepped back, the door half open behind her, leaving space for departure and promise at the same time. It was not a conclusion, nor a resolution. It was a beginning, subtle and deliberate, a quiet assertion that some connections endure even when distance arrives. I remained where I was, watching her for a heartbeat longer, knowing that what had started in small gestures, quiet presence, and patient choices would a promise invisible but unbreakable behind the half-open door.